Imagine you're stepping onto the grounds of a sprawling summer camp in the early morning light. The dew still clings to the grass, and you can hear the quiet anticipation in the air. Children and young adults, some with disabilities, some without, are about to begin a day of spirited activities. There's laughter around every corner, a palpable hope in the atmosphere. And at the center of it all stands a resolute woman in a simple blouse and comfortable shoes, exuding genuine warmth. She greets participants by name, encouraging them to try just a little harder, run just a bit farther, and, more than anything, believe in themselves. This is Eunice Kennedy, a member of America's most famous political dynasty, yet in many ways, a woman who distanced herself from the glitz, expectations, and well-worn corridors of power. Instead, she channeled the entire force of her heritage into a lifelong mission to uplift those whose struggles are often overlooked. Even now, years after her passing, you can practically feel her spirit in the echo of each child's triumphant cheer. Born in 1921, Eunice Mary Kennedy was the fifth of 9 children in the Kennedy clan, raised under the exacting eye of family patriarch Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. In a household that prized competition and public achievement, she learned early on how to assert herself alongside her charismatic siblings, John, Robert, and Ted, who'd each step into the political spotlight. Yet from the beginning, she found her identity outside the conventional path of becoming a socialite or supporting figure to her brothers. She loved sports, devoured books, and took a special interest in people on the margins of society. When the conversation at the dinner table drifted into campaign strategy or talk of climbing the social ladder, Eunice quietly considered how these platforms could uplift the forgotten or voiceless among us. She wasn't necessarily the loudest person in the room, but she was unyielding in conviction, never afraid to challenge others to consider those left behind by the grand illusions of success. At the time, mid-century America was swept up in dynamic changes, post-war optimism, a flourishing economy, and a burgeoning civil rights movement. Yet for many families dealing with developmental and intellectual disabilities, resources were limited and social stigmas abounded. Nursing homes and mental institutions were often the only recourse for parents desperate for help. A hush surrounded the topic. People barely spoke of it, sometimes even hiding the existence of disabled relatives. Growing up in such a climate, Eunice saw firsthand how it affected her elder sister, Rosemary, who was intellectually disabled and faced severe challenges that no one in the Kennedy family circle seemed truly prepared to address. Although the public conversation was basically non-existent, Eunice decided early on that silence would not be her path. As she came of age, she witnessed powerful changes swirling around the country, yet she also recognized a vacuum in the realm of advocacy for individuals like Rosemary. While some could have retreated into quiet acceptance, Eunice harnessed her family's wealth and influence to wage a lifelong battle for those often relegated to institutionalization and invisibility. In these early years, she drew tremendous strength from her Catholic faith. Religious devotion was woven into the fabric of Kennedy life, Mass on Sundays, prayers in the morning. But for Eunice, faith was not just a ceremonial routine. It was a call to action. She once described her religious beliefs as integral to her sense of moral responsibility. If she believed that all human beings were blessed with dignity, then it naturally followed that society had an obligation to cultivate that dignity wherever it was found. Among her siblings, she was sometimes referred to as the most devout, although that label neither magnified nor diminished her personal convictions. She simply treated people, from the wealthiest donor to the humblest volunteer, as potential allies in her mission to ensure the forgotten were forgotten no more. Part of understanding Eunice's background also means understanding the deep complexities that swirled in the Kennedy household. Her father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., had been one of the wealthiest men in America, a former ambassador, a hard-driving businessman who expected excellence in all pursuits. He pinned great hopes on his sons, particularly on the eldest, Joe Jr., who was seen as the chosen heir to the family's political ambitions. Then tragedy struck. Joe Jr. was killed in World War II during a secret bombing mission. It rocked the family to its core. Next, the mantle of success was placed on John F. Kennedy, who would famously become president. Another daughter, Kathleen, died in a plane crash in 1948. It seemed like every time the family soared, another heartbreak followed. Thus, stories of the Kennedy curse emerged. Eunice watched as her parents wrestled with these losses, but she also carried her own heartbreak over her sister Rosemary's difficulties. This was yet another layer of anguish that didn't make the headlines. Within this swirl of tragedy and ambition, Eunice forged a path that combined fierce determination with a big-hearted sense of responsibility. While attending the convent of the Sacred Heart in Manhattan for her early education, she was often teased for her brace-filled teeth and the unwavering seriousness with which she tackled her studies. But teasing didn't deter her. She later attended Stanford University, graduating with a degree in sociology in 1943, an impressive achievement for a young woman at a time when many women were still expected to prioritize marriage and homemaking over academic accolades. Eunice capitalized on the insights her education offered, deepening her understanding of social problems and the factors that fuel them. She carried those lessons into her early work, taking an unconventional job for Kennedy, working in a penitentiary. There, in the Federal Industrial Institution for Women in West Virginia, she witnessed the despair of the incarcerated firsthand, forging a perspective that revolved around hope, education, and dignity for all. As she progressed through her 20s, Eunice's personal life brimmed with possibilities. Suave and good-humored suitors tried their luck, including one notable rumor that she had been informally courted by high-ranking government officials or distant aristocrats, but none truly captivated her heart like Robert Sargent Shriver Jr. did. Shriver, whom she would marry in 1953, shared her commitment to social causes and had a zest for public service. Their union was filled with mutual respect, each supporting the other's ambitions. Both were faithful Catholics, which provided a strong shared foundation. Shriver would eventually become an architect of the Peace Corps and a vice presidential candidate. Yet despite his own remarkable accomplishments, he cherished and championed Eunice's passions. Their marriage brought forth 5 children, including journalist Maria Shriver. But even as her family life grew, she continued forging her mission to transform perceptions around disability. Eunice had seen how limiting social attitudes could be by observing Rosemary's circumstances. The oft-told story is that Rosemary received a lobotomy at the age of 23 at her father's direction because of her extreme mood swings and intellectual challenges. The operation left her largely incapacitated, a painful chapter that was seldom spoken about openly at the time. Even so, the effect on Eunice was profound. She later noted that Rosemary's isolation and difficulties ignited her determination to create safe and nurturing spaces for individuals with intellectual disabilities. Rather than hide in shame or sadness, as was customary for many wealthy families who had a disabled relative, Eunice turned her heartbreak into action. One of the earliest seeds of what would become the Special Olympics took form in the backyard of Eunice's home in Potomac, Maryland, in 1962. She called it Camp Shriver. She invited children with intellectual disabilities to come play sports and enjoy the summer camp experience. It was a radical act for its time. Society typically isolated these children, sometimes institutionalizing them. The thought that they might swim, play ball, ride horses, and compete in friendly contests was revolutionary. Eunice herself was hands-on, swimming alongside campers, cheering them on, and constantly expanding the program's offerings. At first, families were mystified. "Are you sure my child will fit in?" they'd ask. Eunice was resolute, absolutely sure that each child deserved the chance to revel in the simple joys of camp life. As stories of the camp's success spread, volunteers and donors grew in number. Local news outlets began to take note, and soon the camp had more participants than she'd ever dreamed. President Kennedy, influenced in no small part by Eunice's lobbying, had set up panels to explore how to improve mental health care. Eunice capitalized on that momentum. She knew that if one summer camp could demonstrate the abilities and talents of participants so effectively, perhaps a larger stage could ignite a worldwide shift in consciousness. Thus, in 1968, she founded the Special Olympics. The inaugural games were held at Soldier Field in Chicago, drawing a modest crowd of participants from the United States and Canada. But from those small, hopeful beginnings, a powerful movement was born. There were track and field events, swimming competitions, and various other sports. Athletes lined up at the start lines with enormous grins, some holding their families' hands, others bounding with excitement at the thrill of competition. Eunice stood at the center, unwavering, proclaiming, "Let me win. But if I cannot win, let me be brave in the attempt." A motto that captured the very essence of what she stood for. This first Special Olympics event was not without its challenges. Spectators, press, and even some volunteers had a steep learning curve. Many carried preconceived notions about what people with intellectual disabilities could or could not do. The sight of them racing full tilt around a track or diving confidently into a pool shattered stigmas. Eunice was visibly emotional. Eyes misting with tears, she recalled her sister Rosemary and how her life might have been different if only these opportunities for acceptance and participation had existed earlier. Yet her own tears quickly gave way to steadfast resolve. This was just the beginning. The event in Chicago lit a spark that would catch fire in communities around the globe. By the 1970s, Special Olympics programs spread across the United States, Canada, and beyond, connecting local leaders, parents, educators, and medical professionals in a growing network committed to championing inclusive sports. Throughout her life, Eunice encountered those who whispered dismissively, "She's just a do-gooder." Cynics assumed that her philanthropic work served as a pleasant hobby, perhaps a social veneer for the family's tragedies, but they severely underestimated her. Eunice's style of activism was not polite or perfunctory. It was passionate and tough. She went head-to-head with lawmakers, using her family name as a pressure tactic to push for funding, reforms in education, and the dismantling of barriers that prevented people with disabilities from integrating fully into society. She had the ear of the political elite, leaders in Congress, and even presidents, because after all, she was a Kennedy. Yet she never treated that influence like a vanity project. If anything, she viewed her name as a responsibility, a lever that could pry open doors to boardrooms and legislative halls that were otherwise sealed shut to the people she cared about. Friends remembered her phone calls at odd hours. "We need to get this bill moved. When can we meet again? Can we do something this weekend to bring attention to it?" She would muster unrelenting energy, and if a senator or governor happened to be slow-moving, she would make it a point to ring them up repeatedly until action was taken. Stories abound of her forcibly dragging government officials to Special Olympics events, ensuring they saw firsthand the joy and determination of the athletes. One staffer recalled how she once cajoled a reluctant mayor to actually compete alongside the athletes in a short race, just so he'd understand their perspective. She believed in the persuasive power of shared experiences. Observers might view these tactics as bold, maybe even pushy, but for Eunice, it was essential. She was done with half measures and paternalistic pats on the head. She wanted real structural change. Her philanthropic work often intertwined with the broader civil rights movement. She saw connections between the fight for racial equality and the fight for disability inclusion, recognizing that these struggles stemmed from a societal inclination to diminish or other certain groups. Though she wasn't on the front lines of racial justice protests, she lent her voice when the Special Olympics reached communities of color that were doubly marginalized. She was insistent that the movement transcend racial, socioeconomic, and national borders. As the Special Olympics expanded internationally in the 1970s and 1980s, she traveled widely, forging partnerships with local organizations to adapt the model to different cultural contexts. It wasn't uncommon to see her in remote corners of the globe, meeting children who had never participated in organized sports before. She'd clasp their hands and say, "You're an athlete too. Let's show the world what you can do." With her devoted husband, Sergeant Shriver, working alongside her, the two built an extraordinary synergy. He used his political acumen and leadership to champion initiatives such as the War on Poverty under President Lyndon B. Johnson, all while supporting Eunice in the expansion of Special Olympics. The pair became known as a dynamic duo in the philanthropic and political spheres, hosting events at their home that combined high society fundraisers with heartfelt testimonies from the athletes and their families. When their children were old enough, they pitched in as volunteers, bridging the gap between home life and activism in the most natural way possible. One rarely shared the anecdote involves a Thanksgiving dinner that Eunice hosted, where she invited a group of Special Olympics athletes to share not only the holiday meal but also their personal stories. As plates of turkey and stuffing were passed around, so were tales of triumph over adversity, leaving no one at that table unchanged by the end of the night. Eunice's unwavering dedication often put her on a collision course with societal norms. For example, in certain circles, it was deemed inappropriate to feature people with intellectual disabilities so prominently in public events. Didn't that invite ridicule, some worried? Wasn't it exploitative, others wondered? But Eunice's perspective was that pity and avoidance were far more damaging forms of exploitation. She argued that the real disservice was treating these individuals as though they had nothing to contribute. Public displays of joy, ambition, and athletic prowess were precisely what the world needed to see. She welcomed the debate, confident that the visual impact and emotional resonance of inclusion would silence the naysayers. Inevitably, controversies found their way to her doorstep, sometimes from unexpected corners. Some critics pointed to the Kennedy family's own past with Rosemary, questioning how they'd handled her institutionalization and lobotomy. To be fair, it was a complicated web of paternalism, medical ignorance of the time, and perhaps a misguided attempt by Joseph Kennedy Sr. to shield Rosemary from a life without independence. Eunice was left to rectify, or at least grapple with those choices as she matured. She rarely spoke publicly against her father, but her entire life's work seemed to stand as a testament that no one with a disability should be hidden away or dismissed. Others debated the scale and costs of the Special Olympics. Was it feasible to expand so quickly across multiple countries? Were the organizational structures transparent? Despite these disputes, Eunice rarely flinched. She believed that any large-scale movement attracting global attention was bound to stir controversy. Her task was to remain steadfast to her mission while continuously refining the institution she'd built. One fascinating aspect of Eunice's character was the humility with which she approached her philanthropic achievements, even as some recognized her as the most impactful Kennedy of the 20th century in terms of direct social change. She won multiple honors, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1984, America's highest civilian award, bestowed by President Ronald Reagan. The citation recognized her pioneering work in the Special Olympics, praising her for helping to create a global movement of understanding and inclusion. While gracious, she often deflected applause away from herself, directing it toward her athletes. She believed that the participants in Special Olympics were not charity cases, but people who, given a chance, could become shining examples to the rest of society on how to be courageous, optimistic, and determined. There's a lesser-known story about her 80th birthday celebration. Friends and dignitaries gathered to toast her achievements, and speaker after speaker lauded her pioneering spirit. When it came time for Eunice to respond, she stood at the podium, patiently waiting for the applause to die down. Then she began telling a story about a young athlete from a remote region who, after earning a medal in a Special Olympics event, used that victory to motivate his entire village to see the potential of individuals with disabilities. She recounted how the athlete's mother had once told her that her son's success had sparked local reforms in education and accessibility. It was the athlete's story, Eunice insisted, that was worth celebrating. By the end of her speech, half the audience was in tears, moved by the stark reminder that the real heroes were the thousands upon thousands of participants worldwide. In many ways, Eunice was motivated by a desire to right a profound cultural wrong. Society's norms too often cast out individuals who don't fit a narrow definition of able-bodied or able-minded. Through her empathy and unyielding focus, she demonstrated that the lines we draw between able and disabled are more porous than we realize. She emphasized that each person's capabilities and limitations are unique. Her approach was less about highlighting disability and more about celebrating every individual's potential, something that resonates even more deeply in today's conversations about inclusivity and mental health awareness. Eunice's early efforts predated many of the movements that would later become prominent, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. And while she didn't single-handedly bring about all these legislative milestones, she unquestionably laid significant groundwork for the cultural shift that made them possible. This ties into the broader theme, often called the Kennedy curse, that near mythical pattern of tragic events befalling one of America's most storied families: plane crashes, assassinations, accidents, scandals, heartbreak. Eunice was acutely aware of how these catastrophes shaped public perception of the Kennedys, but she didn't see tragedy as a final verdict. She saw it as an impetus for compassion. While her brothers strove for public office and paid the highest price in some instances, Eunice wielded kindness, activism, and moral courage as her counter-curse. She turned heartache into a kind of unstoppable empathy engine, driving forward relentlessly to ensure that others might avoid or overcome the pain that her own family had suffered, especially in the shadows of medical misunderstanding and social stigma. By the 1980s and 1990s, Special Olympics had blossomed into a major international organization featuring local, state, national, and world competitions. Athletes who participated, who might have once been hidden away, now had opportunities for travel, camaraderie, personal growth, and recognition. Eunice traveled to multiple continents, never content to merely observe from a distance. She was known for stepping right onto the fields with participants, praising them, consoling them when they lost, and celebrating wholeheartedly when they won. The press would sometimes attempt to pivot the narrative to focus solely on the Kennedy name, but Eunice would swiftly pivot back, highlighting the athletes as the rightful stars. She was also known to engage with families, providing resources and support to parents who needed guidance on educational access or medical issues for their children. Essentially, the Special Olympics were part sporting event, part global awareness campaign, and part support network, a trifecta that reshaped how society perceived individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. While she is rightly lauded for her philanthropic achievements, another layer of Eunice's story is the personal toll such relentless dedication can take. There were undoubtedly moments of exhaustion, times she might have wanted to retreat from the public eye, especially as her siblings faced tragedies. By the time she reached her 70s, she had witnessed the loss of 4 of her siblings, Joe Jr., Kathleen, John, and Robert, and endured the ordeal of Rosemary's condition. Yet, close friends and family describe her as unwavering. She believed that the best way to honor the memory of lost loved ones was to press on with good works. If she had regrets, they were rarely voiced. Instead, she poured herself into championing an entire community she loved. She was known for writing personal letters to Special Olympics participants, congratulating them on their achievements, inquiring about their well-being, and encouraging them to dream bigger. Some recipients of those letters, now in their later years, still treasure the notes, testaments to the personal devotion that burned at the center of her global mission. Given the philanthropic spotlight, it's sometimes easy to forget that Eunice also had a full personal life with her children and grandchildren. She nurtured a tight-knit family environment, teaching her own kids the value of empathy and service. Journalist Maria Shriver, in particular, has recounted how her mother embodied a never-take-no for an answer spirit when it came to doing good for others. And while Eunice's kids might occasionally have rolled their eyes at her unstoppable enthusiasm, they recognized the authenticity behind it. It was no performance. Even at home, away from cameras, she would often talk about the power of inclusivity as though it were a simple, universal truth everyone should understand. As her children matured and forged their own paths, they carried her moral torch in different ways, some continuing her philanthropic legacy directly, others supporting it from behind the scenes. The thread that connected all of them was her steadfast belief that giving back was not a choice, but an imperative. In the public eye, the Kennedy name still carried an aura of intrigue. Speeches delivered by her brothers, especially President John F. Kennedy, hammered at the idea of public service and a sense of duty. Yet if you ask those who intimately knew Eunice, many would say that her brand of service was the purest manifestation of that creed. It was less about power and more about empowerment. She championed the idea that each person, politician, celebrity, or everyday individual, could do their part to uplift those around them, particularly the most vulnerable. In an era where philanthropic work could sometimes be overshadowed by vanity or publicity stunts, Eunice's genuine passion stood out. Among the lesser discussed aspects of her life is how she navigated complex family dynamics in the wake of her siblings' tragedies. She was close to her brother Ted, who outlived most of the family. Together they shared a moral drive for advocacy, Ted focusing primarily on healthcare legislation in the U.S. Senate, and Eunice championing disability rights through the Special Olympics. When Ted pushed for legislation that would benefit individuals with disabilities, Eunice was there to provide real-life stories and case studies gleaned from her work. They both recognized that, far from being tangential, these issues lay at the heart of a just society. Though neither was naive to the family's sometimes tarnished reputation, amid rumors of scandal or controversies surrounding other Kennedys, they refused to let that overshadow the necessity of legislation and activism that could save and enrich lives. Inevitably, the question arises, how did Eunice view the so-called Kennedy curse? Did she believe her family was doomed? While she rarely spoke of it directly, she did occasionally address the notion that the Kennedys were singled out by fate for unrelenting calamity. She dismissed the idea that tragedy was a cosmic punishment or an inescapable destiny. Instead, she saw it as a call to harness every ounce of influence and passion for a cause that would outlast the sorrow. When asked once offhand how she coped with the loss of her brothers, she merely said, "You try to make something good happen for someone else." That succinct reply typified her approach. Grief transformed into benevolent action. Controversies did sometimes swirl around the Special Olympics itself. Some disability activists argued that while the Games were empowering, they might inadvertently perpetuate a certain paternalistic narrative, emphasizing separation rather than integration into mainstream sports. Eunice listened, but she countered that the ideal was not separation, but a supportive stepping stone to broader participation and acceptance. She saw the Special Olympics as a necessary stepping stone when mainstream institutions still balked at including individuals with special needs. Over time, though, the lines began to blur, with some Special Olympics athletes moving into mainstream athletic programs. Eunice took pride in these strides, believing it meant the organization had served its purpose of elevating individuals until society could match their enthusiasm. She embraced critiques, too, seeing them as opportunities to refine and improve the movement. As the decades marched forward, her health began to wane. Still, she remained a vocal figurehead for the Special Olympics. In one especially poignant moment in the 2000s, she attended the Special Olympics World Summer Games and stood among the crowd, frail but determined, cheering with the same gusto she'd had decades earlier. Some footage shows her gently leaning on others for support, yet still beaming. In those final years, interviews with her carried a more reflective tone. She spoke about the joys of seeing a once shy athlete step onto the podium to claim a medal, or a parent's face lighting up after witnessing their child's achievements. She wanted those stories to endure beyond her own lifetime, so the world would never again question whether a person with intellectual disabilities deserved a place in the spotlight. Eunice Mary Kennedy Shriver passed away in 2009 at the age of 88. Tributes poured in from across the globe. Former presidents, sports figures, disability activists, and of course the countless families touched by her advocacy. Attendees at her funeral recalled the remarkable blend of mourning and celebration. This wasn't just a farewell to another Kennedy, but to a woman who had bent the arc of social history toward inclusivity. Her burial was marked by quiet eulogies, but also by a sense that the baton she carried was now firmly in the hands of the millions who believed in her vision. True to her style, her final public statements didn't dwell on the tragedies of her family or her own accolades. They reflected on the athletes she so dearly loved, urging society to see their potential as inherently human. For the countless individuals with disabilities who found acceptance, pride, and joy on those athletic fields, Eunice was nothing short of a guardian angel. She forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about how it treats its most vulnerable, forging a path toward greater inclusivity. Her story reminds us of the power one individual can wield when fueled by personal conviction and unwavering kindness. And it begs us to remember that behind the official photograph of a so-called cursed family, real people grieve, learn, and hope just like the rest of us, but have the potential, if determined enough, to alter the course of history in doing so. In drawing this story to a close, we might look at Eunice's life as a beam of light cutting through the darker chapters of the Kennedy saga. Yes, her family faced unbelievable losses, and yes, tragedy seemed to lurk around every corner. But rather than allow those storms to consume her spirit, she lit a candle of compassion that still glows today, carried by the millions of volunteers, athletes, and supporters who keep her mission alive. Her message rings clear that an act of kindness, no matter how small, can chip away at the seemingly impenetrable walls of injustice and misunderstanding. Ultimately, Eunice Kennedy Shriver offers us a powerful narrative on how to respond to life's inevitable sorrows, not with despair or cynicism, but with resolute love and an unyielding faith in the human capacity for goodness. May her memory remind us that the grace we extend to others can be a mighty force indeed, capable of dispelling even the darkest shadows. After all, curses, or what feel like curses, may be unavoidable in life, but how we respond is up to us. If we take a page from Eunice's life, the choice is clear. We stand up, we speak out, and we keep our hearts trained on kindness, determined to ensure that no voice goes unheard, no dream remains unexplored, and no athlete stands alone on the field. That is how Eunice Kennedy fought the so-called curse, by replacing fear with hope and heartbreak with endless compassion. And in doing so, she invited the rest of us to continue the race, hand in hand, stride by stride, toward a world where every individual, no matter their ability, is welcomed with open arms.